So thank you, Erwin and Igor, for the invitation. I've had a really great few days. And I'm excited to get a chance to tell you all about some recent work of mine that's joint with Igor, Maria, Dean, and Luke Mulaney recently on Koopman learning for episodic with episodic memory. Now, this joke won't work as well without Igor in the room, I guess. But so 2 years ago, we submitted a paper to the Learning for Dynamics and Control conference, and reviewers who had some strong opinions about our use of saying that Koopman operator theory has enabled state-of-the-art prediction and control. And if you know Igor, you can imagine just about how well this review went over with him. Now, I think this sort of position has become increasingly indefensible in the state of control. We've seen a number of really great results from Harry and Joel, and also a lot of work from the software robotics community, including Erwin's work, showing that control can enable really good, or Koopman with control can enable really good models. Okay, we're not. It's good to know. Uh, and so, and there has been, of course, a lot of really good work with forecasting, and this is why we wrote what we did. But I do think in hindsight, it's worth pointing out or realizing that maybe some of the same sort of results that have been found in control with the characterization and comparison with different methods, maybe is a little lacking with the forecasting work. Although maybe if you're getting the same reviews, there could be more to be done. But anyway, so this motivated some thoughts about just how good are Koopman forecasts, especially standard methods. And then in the case that these standard methods fail, and we know that they do, what can we do to make them more state-of-the-art, or at least better? So it would be great to have some benchmarking. And there's been work in this direction in the machine learning sort of inspired or infused community, or the community that's using Koopman operator theory and infusing that with machine learning. So this is from a paper, this table, which I've purposely left very large just to illustrate the extent of which the benchmarking has been done. It was in a paper that introduced this method called Koopa, and you see it's on 6 different data sets. They compare their model against 8 other methods or 7 other methods, and they look at a bunch of different forecasting horizons, and they find that theirs is the best. And I think it would be great to do something like this with standard Koopman methods, but I do think it's worth noting that in the case where you have a static data set, so in this case, any one of these data sets, even if you do things in a cross-validated way, you can just keep trying things and keep training your model or keep making adjustments until you find that now it's whatever I have is state-of-the-art. And the more free parameters you have, if you have 100 million parameter neural network, you can probably find a better end goal or end solution than something like sliding Hankel DMD, which only has 3 free parameters. This is despite the fact that that 100 million parameter neural network might not actually be very generalizable on new data, or not more generalizable than, say, something like sliding Hankel DMD. So for this reason, I was interested in looking at a live forecasting sort of setting. So one community that's been big on this is the infectious disease community, where they've had a number of forecasting challenges or cooperative crowdsourcing, if you want to be a little more optimistic. For instance, in the US, the Center for Disease and Control, or the CDC, has been hosting this flu site challenge for about 15 years, where they ask modelers to submit forecasts for all 50 states, US states, 2 regions, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and the US as a whole, and ask for the 1, 2, 3, and 4 week ahead forecasts on a number of cases or number of hospitalizations. And so this, like I said, has been going on for 15 years. There's often now about 40 teams that submit models. There's a lot of expertise that's been developed in this. So if we want to compare some standard method like sliding Hankel DMD to an area where there's a strong baseline, this has seemed like a good setting. On the other hand, there was recently this initiative from the Public Health Department of Ontario and University of Guelph in Canada to have sort of something similar in Canada. So there was this AI forecasting hub challenge where they asked for predictions, again, 1, 2, 3, and 4 weeks ahead on the number of positive laboratory detections, or the percent of lab tests that would come back positive for COVID, RSV, and the flu. And this was the first year this was done. So this was sort of a setting where we could see how good is Koopman methods when you don't necessarily have as much expertise or as much data. And like I said, so from November to May, I submitted weekly forecasts using sliding Hankel DMD to these different sites. And why sliding Hankel DMD? Well, there are three reasons. The first is it's a very simple method, and it's something where there's a lot of sort of existing code and some already work showing that it can work well. So it seemed like maybe not the best case scenario, maybe not the worst case scenario, but the most likely case scenario for someone who might be trying this. Secondly, the sliding part was sort of motivated by the fact that this data is non-stationary and sort of strongly so. So of course there's seasonality with the flu where there's rises of cases in the winter and decreases in the summer. But the exact dynamics depend on different latent states like the temperature, the weather, the strains of flu that are present, and these can vary year to year. So you can see large amounts of variability in the actual flu dynamics, in this case, the number of cases. And so if you wanted to predict the blue season, or what ultimately becomes a blue season, using the too much data of the pink season, then you would do a relatively poor job. So one way to take care of this is to just construct temporally local models. And then third, why use Koopman at all? And this is something that's been brought up like on the boat. And I think it's important to recognize, at least before Trump and RFK Jr., there was sort of this movement in the US, at least, that within individual states and within some individual counties, there's a push towards getting local public health departments to have their own models. And of course, these public health departments often don't have computational resources or technical know-how. So something like a neural network model, they might not be able to run, but something linear and small is appealing. And if you could have sort of more computational capacity using these sort of Koopman methods, that would be ideal. So I think there's real benefit of using something like Koopman for this problem. So this past flu season, at least in the US, was the first one since 2017 to be categorized as severe. So which meant that it hit some sort of threshold. And you can see that additionally, the sort of peak in hospitalizations in the US and as a whole was in like mid-February, which was a lot later than in previous years, which was more in December and in January. So if we look at what does the state of the art do, so state of the art, of course, is hard to say in these things because each flu season is different. But Carnegie Mellon has this time series method that has sort of consistently been one of the top performing models for the past 8 years. And you can see, and so this is their sort of forecast. They're shown in red, which I guess looks a little maybe more brown on the screen. And so you can see that because of this delayed nature of the peak, and because of also the much stronger amplitude as compared to the past few years, which this Carnegie Mellon is sort of biased towards using for constructing its model, the Carnegie Mellon model underpredicts both in terms of amplitude and also it's thinking that there's going to be a decrease in the number of hospitalizations when there isn't. And this is true not only for sort of late December, but also or I guess mid-January. Now, in contrast, we see that the sort of sliding Hankel DMD does a good job of capturing this continued peak. And so up to the first 6 weeks, actually, sliding Hankel DMD was the third best model out of about 40. But this is maybe too much of a good thing because then we see that it explodes. And this really comes from the fact, this is both the pro and the con, that if you only have some local amount of data, then you're seeing something sort of looking exponential. And truly, if you look at sort of, I guess, the US hospitalization, it is looking something exponential. You're going to do a poor job of fitting. And I think, maybe we could have been a little bit more careful with the numerics and use some better methods, which might have helped mitigate some of the explosion. But I think the sort of larger point stands. And if you look at the season as a whole, at the very beginning of the season, like I said, it does better than the Carnegie Mellon method. Later in the season, it does about the same. This black dashed line is this baseline. So this is the persistence forecast that we talked about on the boat, where you're just sort of predicting the same thing as what you're currently seeing for the next 4 weeks. And in the middle of the season, not only does sliding Hankel DMD do worse than the Carnegie Mellons, but it does significantly worse than the baseline as well. So that's not great. And this is true both for the national and the state level. So it's sort of as an interim to those two questions, at the beginning of this season and at the end, when the dynamics are relatively simple or monotonic, sliding Hankel DMD can do well, but during the peak, it really struggles. And so what's needed is some way to recognize dynamics in the past that are relevant to what you're currently seeing to get more reasonable predictions. So this leads to the question of how do you actually identify relevant dynamics? And it would be nice to do this in a way that doesn't abandon the Koopman framework. And I do want to mention very briefly that I think this gets to some extent maybe at this point that Harry brought up on the first day, which is, some people try these methods, and if you see something like this, you see some sort of failure, you might just give up. So it'd be nice to have something that also could be included sort of in addition to this to improve performance. Okay, so to get where we ended up, I'll show you this simple example where we have the synthetic data, and it switches between four dynamical regimes. There's a little bit of noise, but every 10 time steps, it switches from either being exponentially increasing, exponentially decreasing, oscillating that's growing, or oscillating that's decreasing. And if you apply in a sort of artificial setting, a window of size 5, and then you're trying to predict 5 steps into the future, you see you do quite poorly. And part of this, not the whole reason, but part of this is from the fact that your sliding window contains data from 2 different dynamical regimes. And this has been pointed out previously by Senka, Nolita, and Igor, showing that when you have a mixed window, your eigenvalues, your computation of the true eigenvalues, or your computation of eigenvalues is not good relative to the true eigenvalues. And they actually showed that this problem's more persistent than just that. If you have sort of a continuous time dependence, it's very hard to properly identify the appropriate Koopman eigenvalues. So this is bleak, and like Zlatko said in his talk, if you can't reconstruct your data, maybe you don't have much of a hope about predicting. But I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that, at least in this very simple case, if we look at 2 windows that occur sort of on the cusp of 2 different, or have the same kinds of transitions, so you're going from exponentially increasing to oscillating, that's shrinking. We know from the previous slides that this model that you learned isn't good. It doesn't give you great forecasts, but the eigenvalues and the modes are sort of consistent between these 2 different repetitions of the same transition. And this is true for this specific transition and others. So as sort of almost a representation, this suggests that maybe looking in the past when we have the same Koopman eigenvalues and modes to what we're currently seeing might be useful for informing us of when in the past have we seen dynamics that are similar, and we might be able to use that sort of information to improve forecasting. So more specifically, we took our window, I just shown in the inset here, where we have data that's maybe doing something that's decaying, maybe not exactly exponential. We have some associated eigenvalues and modes, and now we look, we compare those eigenvalues and modes to all the eigenvalues and modes that we've seen in the past from other sliding windows. So we might find that, of course, there's some sliding windows where we have very different dynamics, as shown here, for instance, where we have an oscillation, and so we'll have different eigenvalues and possibly different modes. And then there might be a case, though, where the dynamics are very similar, in which case we might have pretty similar eigenvalues and similar modes. And if they're sufficiently close, the eigenvalues and the modes, we said there's some sort of a match. Now, there might be, in this sort of hypothetical, some aspect of the system that leads to a switch. So say you're decaying, and then all of a sudden, once you hit a certain point, your system starts to oscillate. And maybe we saw that last time. In this case, if those sort of properties of the system remain the same or remain constant, then we might again expect to see some sort of a switch. And so, which you wouldn't ever really guess from just looking at this data in the window. So if that sort of property is consistent, then predicting that we're going to see some sort of oscillation might be helpful and might improve prediction. Okay, so maybe this works for our synthetic data where we have exactly the same different kinds of dynamical regimes, but what about real data? So not every non-autonomous or non-stationary dynamical system will have this recurrence, but there are some that do. And so, for instance, we see in 2005, 2008, and 2015, there's a rise, a plateau, and then a sharp increase in the number of flu cases. And so it'd be nice to know that in 2015 that when we're seeing this plateau, where it's not just going to continue to plateau, but there's going to be a sharp increase. And maybe this sort of idea of comparing the eigenvalues and the modes would be a useful way to identify sort of which parts of the past we should be remembering or paying attention to in 2015. So if we apply this method to the flu site data and forecast, you see that it can act as a nice sort of regularizer, and it can correctly predict, I guess I don't have the labels, but the light blue here is the Hankel DMD, sliding Hankel DMD with memory, and the dark blue is without. the sort of standard method. So you see the standard method continues to blow up, whereas with memory sort of rectifies this problem. And not only can it sort of predict this decrease, there are cases, and this is cherry picked, but there's some cases where we can not only just predict that there's going to be a decrease, but capture some other aspect of the dynamics. So for instance, in Colorado, we saw after the first peak, like many other states, there was a sort of a dip and followed by a second peak. And you can see that the memory is able to sort of extract some previous time in the past where there was also this period. And by looking at the eigenvalues and the modes, identified that that sort of was similar to what we were currently seeing in Colorado. Now, it doesn't always work if you apply this memory approach too early. Just like with Carnegie Mellon's method, you're going to predict sort of an early decrease in cases. And there are cases where we don't have a match. So we have some thresholds for what we consider to be a match, and then you're not guaranteed to find a match. And so, for instance, here you can see that the DMD, this sort of sliding angle DMD, and the DMD with memory end up with the same forecast. So it can't always improve. But if we're careful about when we use memory and what we do in the case where we have bad predictions, we can do really significantly improve our forecasting. So on the bottom is this method, or the model with sort of smart use of memory and this with thresholding when your prediction's too high. In the third column is if we just use sliding Hankel DMD, and then the top two are Carnegie Mellon's and this baseline. And we can see that when we use memory intelligently, we can drop the error, so smaller is better, to be a lot closer to the Carnegie Mellon's and below the baseline. And in some cases, like at the national level, we're outperforming Carnegie Mellon's forecasting. Okay, and I don't think, so the other point I want to mention is that we saw a sort of similar story when it came to the Canadian data, where we saw overshooting for RSV and flu using sliding Hankel DMD, and actually a little bit of undershooting when it came to COVID, because for specific unknown reasons, the Canadian COVID during the winter just kept dropping until the very end of the summer when there was a rise. And now there were only two other teams that submitted enough forecasts to be considered robust enough for evaluation. And these two teams, one's from University of British Columbia and one was from Virginia Tech, they both competed or sort of submitted forecasts with the flu site challenge in the past. So they're not just randoms who don't have any experience. But we found that despite sort of the issues with our sliding Hankel DMD with these explosions, it still outperformed these other two models. And I think a big part of this is due to the fact that since this was the first year that this data was available, and the fact that these teams actually did have experience and they had models presumably that were trained or developed with the US in mind, when they went to Canada, maybe they didn't perform enough calibration or something, and so they actually performed worse than an approach that was data agnostic, like sliding Hankel DMD. We can further improve the performance using memory again. On the Canadian data, both for flu and RSV, we can sort of rectify this problem of overshooting. And in the case of COVID, we could rectify this problem of undershooting. And you can see that also for different provinces. One interesting thing about Canada is the population distribution is quite dispersed relative to the US. 30% of the population lives in Ontario. So some of these provinces are a lot smaller, like Nova Scotia. So as sort of a summary, we were able to sort of improve the performance of a standard Koopman method, sliding Hankel DMD, not by changing how we were computing the eigenvalues and the spectral objects, but what we were doing with them. In particular, we weren't using them for prediction other than to sort of find matches in the past. And that this could lead, in some cases, to a significantly better performance. Everything I've shown, though, is very heuristic. We don't have any real theory for what kinds of dynamical systems this would work well for. We don't have a great idea of, and I think maybe one appealing aspect of this is also for analysis. So, this tells you that when you have similar eigenvalues and modes, to some point in the past, maybe you can gain more insight by also looking at what was happening in the past and using some knowledge of that. So it could be useful potential for trying to probe more specific structure in your system. And then from the numeric side, especially for the US, we had these very tall, thin matrices. So maybe some of Ella's work would be useful there for computing the eigenvalues. We don't know how to reliably or when we should be reliably using memory. Of course, one of the challenges here is that memory and the sliding angle DMD, it's most important to use the memory when it really differs from the sliding angle DMD, but you're not always sure which one is the reliable one to choose. And this was just a last minute thought, but often we do this for computing the eigenvalues, we do something where we care about the reconstruction error, but maybe if we know that reconstruction won't always be good, maybe we could optimize for finding the eigenvalues with an eye towards sort of thinking about what linear representation would allow you to most coherently separate different dynamical regimes that are useful for using memory. And then I'm not an MPC person at all, but I was thinking when it comes to something like traffic, if you're in stop and go traffic, if the cars ahead of you start to move, your Koopman model might say, okay, things are moving, so I'm going to predict a continued increase in speed, so I should start to accelerate. But if you've ever been in that kind of traffic, you know there's going to be braking soon, so you shouldn't just gun it. You should sort of, with an eye towards the fact that there is a high probability that you're going to be braking, adjust your speed from that. And then I guess the last thing was, I think most of these results were motivated by and came from using this on live forecasting, and that was also a lot of fun. These challenges, the flu site and the AI forecasting are open to anybody, so I think it would be maybe a nice thing for the community to get a little bit more involved in, and I'm happy to help if anyone's interested in getting set up on this. Thanks.